I appreciate that it has been a long afternoon. So let's keep this session as interactive as possible. As for introductions, and without going down too far down Isha's list of distinguished resume, Ishal is currently the Communications and Digital Advisor and formerly the MCMC Chairman. So Ishal used to eat, sleep, and drink 5G. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, we launched the 5G idea with YB Gobin in 2019.
And to recap, under his watch, 5G was planned to be commercialized in third quarter 2020.
Exactly. Actually, it was July was the target date then.
All right. So all in all, I believe there is nobody else more qualified and suitable to do this rep and share further insights on today's proceedings. So let's kick off. And perhaps, for the benefit of our audience, can you share with us what your role as advisor entails and why are you doing this pro bono?
Thank you. I get that question a lot. Essentially, I think my career has been TMT for the last 31 years. 24 years on my own as an entrepreneur, 5 years in corporate Malaysia with Malaysia Airlines, AirAsia, etc., and 2 years in government. Now, looking at where the transition is happening next, which is where we are at now, and the topics for today's discussion is there, I really wanted to be able to have a platform to contribute back. And the 2 years in MCMC was really an eye-opener. Now, as to what the role entails, essentially it just means that I'm available for the minister to seek any views. He doesn't have to listen. He can seek from me. I can tell him. It is entirely up to him to use it. Potentially attend some meetings, essentially that. But I guess as we heard today, we are going through a very fascinating and rapid change in the country, from the infrastructure standpoint to the cloud and adoption, etc. So this phase is a very interesting phase for us. I'm not so alone. Earlier today, I saw Datuk Syaril Tamizi and Afzal, the name that keeps cropping up. They are also pro bono advisors to Ministry of Transport. From the context of the digitalization of the MOT's platforms.
Indeed. Thanks, Ishal. So we have heard from YB Minister in his keynote address and from the 3 panel discussions earlier. The aim of this dialogue is to really clarify and elaborate with your personal insights on the topics and issues we covered today. And more importantly, as a research house, we want to answer 2 or 3 questions for our investors. First, we believe, and as Dr. Umar alluded this morning or earlier this afternoon, that the telco sector valuation has derated from 9 times to 7 times EV/EBITDA. And this was when service revenue growth, ARPU, EBITDA margins were rather flattish. And this was all since the single wholesale network, or DNB, was launched. And due mainly to the lack of transparency, as we heard, and investor concerns on the risks for telco operators from the rollout of 5G infrastructure and the services. So the question is, have we seen the worst from the telco sector from the policy perspective, at least? The second question we want to try answer, or find an answer for our investors is that, how are the telco operators going to generate returns or monetize this investment that they're putting out in 5G? What are the use cases that we are, potentially looking at? And finally, the third question we want to address is we believe adopting and migrating to cloud would improve efficiency and productivity and ultimately profits and valuation. Can we identify winners and losers by understanding their digitalization strategy? Hence why we've had that discussion on cloud and all that earlier. So now let's circle back to YB Minister's speech earlier and panel 1 discussion. And I'll just fire the first question for you, and perhaps you can elaborate on this. Do you feel that policies are shifting back to what you envision it to be when you were at MCMC? And if not, what is the ideal landing point for you?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Nick. I believe that the entire world, and Malaysia is no exception, we are progressing in this phase, getting into 5G. So to the question of, has the market seen the bottom of it? My personal view is yes. Now, let's look at today, the discussions that we had today, it is very clear that the government policy decision has been made, and the process of transition led by the National 5G Task Force with Dato' Johan and Dato' Muhammad Fauzi are well into progress per the announcement yesterday. So we look forward to a landing at the end of June towards the equity agreement as well as the access agreement for DMB as we see it today. Naturally, there could be a few permutations in terms of equity, whether the government stays in or out 100%, etc. That time will tell. Nevertheless, as you had rightly put, the real issue or the real focus is now then into use cases, applications, etc. And this is where it gets very interesting. In 2019, when we first explored 5G as a country, we were very early. We had 100 use cases, 72 from the private sector and 28 from the government, across 56 5G sites, across many states in Malaysia. So I know the telcos, the MNOs today were not really going too deep into that, because I think their discussions right now is still at infrastructure. But our telcos and MNOs are extremely familiar with the various use cases that's available. So for example, let's look at the economic structure. In Malaysia, manufacturing forms approximately 22% of GDP. Then we have, so of course that's manufacturing as a whole, but within the subsectors in manufacturing, there are clearly early adopters that can benefit from 5G and later on. I mean, our E&E sector, etc., are clear winners. Automotive, right? There's an announcement last year and this year about the Automotive High-Tech Valley in Tanjung Malim. So there's a 30 billion investment from Geely. Now clearly, and even though Maxis has signed an MOU, I think, with Proton in terms of exploring, delivering 5G for robotics, potentially, in a manufacturing hub. And then you look at ports. There was much talk about ports. So from a camera perspective, security, cybersecurity, as well as operational efficiency, with the cloud, they are another big user. When you look at the second sector for Malaysia is agriculture. Now, we import in 2018 60 billion ringgit worth of nothing fancy, vegetables and fruits. So technically, can you imagine when the infrastructure is available and adoption of IoT, etc., is widely adopted, then you're looking at the potential for various new companies and startups coming into the space and benefiting from it. And then you look at travel, tourism. There are various other sectors and various use cases. If I may circle back, what it means is, although the discussion in Malaysia for the last 2 years has been 5G infrastructure, single wholesale network, etc., the real horizon, the real portal into the beneficiaries of 5G and cloud, etc., has not really begun, but is about to, beginning with the resolution of our current single to dual transition, and potentially even 5.5G, 6G, etc. Underlying that, fiber is important. So I know a lot of the stock picks around the country has been Telecom Malaysia and all that. Nevertheless, it is not just telecom and time. As an industry insider for the last 31 years, there are many companies, there are small SMEs that own kilometers of fiber in various states, in various locations. The opportunity to consolidate those fiber providers. So in Penang, for example, I don't know the company name, and I shall not, even if I knew, I wouldn't name it, but I don't know the company name. They have 928 kilometers of fiber around the island and the mainland. So not just where areas TM and time goes to, but there are also many licensees and holders of fiber.
Thank you for that. So just zooming in on this use case topic. I was just outside the hall speaking to an old friend, and he was sharing with me that in Korea, they find that 5G users, after not very long being on 5G, decided to opt back to 4G because there's just not enough reason for him to be in on 5G. Notwithstanding the cost, but there's just no reason whatsoever. And going back to your point on, there are many use cases that you've also seen in pilot projects that you experimented on while you were at MCMC. So clearly, and as our panelists also shared earlier, there were various applications that they are working on, whether in oil and gas sector, manufacturing, and all. So the question is, should the government and the private sector really be focusing on developing the use case first, rather than coming out or rolling out infrastructure as they do now? Just wanting to better understand that process. Yeah,
I think sequencing is what we're looking at, right?
Yeah.
And sequencing, like any other industry, TMT is no different. We need the baseline infrastructure. I would agree with you that probably there is an overemphasis on the infrastructure, but nevertheless, the infrastructure is required first before the adoption can happen. So, for example, looking back, what we did in 2019, 5G is all predicated upon use cases, primarily enterprise and government. So we, as MCMC then, we released free spectrum on a pilot basis for 6 months for telcos to use. They need to apply, but there was no fees attached to it. And it was location-based, so that we can avoid interference, etc. And we allowed the telcos with their own investment. So 143 million ringgit was spent by the telcos and MNOs back then on those 100 use cases in order to deploy that. Now, I got to jump back to your statement about South Korea 4G, 5G. So the difference that gives us the speed that Minister and the MNOs are talking about is essentially your tower that delivers the cellular signal needs to be fiberized. On 4G today, there are locations in KL and Johor and Penang that you can get 100 to 200 megabits per second. In Yikman, in Tanjung Malim, if you're having coffee there and you do your Maxis speed test, it will be 150 to 170 megabits per second because of their collaboration with Proton. So they had improved the Maxis coverage there in order to have high speeds on 4G. So the point is, yes, for the consumers, 4G is good enough. So the banter earlier between Alban and Eng was quite funny, but essentially 4G, 5G, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, etc., they all have their place in the value chain of connectivity. It does not mean that we need 5G to be widely prevalent, because if there's no use. Now for consumers, yes, when I tether, I do use my 5G, but otherwise, I switch off my 5G, I'm on 4G, because it just takes my battery all the way, and the speeds that I get from my multiple service providers are between 20 to 60 megabits per second on an average, and that's more than sufficient. So, however, ask the gamers, which many may not be in this room, except for one that I know, then they do need the 5G on their Asus ROG phone to, have the low latencies, etc.
I'm too old.
We are too old
to be on the gamer community. But just a reminder to the audience to use the Slido for questions. I'm still not seeing any questions come in yet, but before I open up to the floor, maybe physically later, the next question for you is on DNB. So the former MOF once said that there are interested foreign parties to buy equity stakes in DNB. So if there are serious proposals on the table, what would or should be the key considerations for the government? And how would an entry of major foreign player or players impact the sector landscape, in your view?
I remember that very clearly. It was September last year, actually. Our former Minister of Finance, Tengku Zafrul, mentioned that there is a possibility, or there are possibilities, if the take-up of equity in DNB is not fully subscribed, or the government decides to sell more than 70%, then they may open up to foreign telecommunications companies. So two things. Number one, our Malaysian regulatory framework do allow more than 51% equity, in fact up to 70% equity in NFP licensees. NSP, services for applications, about up to 100%. So that's one background. The second one is more interesting. We had Swiss Telecom, remember? In Mutiara Telecom, which is a foreign company, investing in Mutiara Telecom, which became Digi. And we have Telenor in Digi, and Telenor is still here today with Celcom Digi. In Maxis, we've got Saudi Telecom. So Malaysia, as a country, has had a history of foreign investors in telecoms sector. My view is competition is always the mother of all inventions. And I do believe that if it comes to that, if we have more foreign investors, whether it's investors or telecommunications companies, in the country, it will stimulate the ability or the companies delivering services. It will stimulate efficiency and productivity and the adoption of technologies, etc. And I think it is a positive thing. I think in a global world where we have seen Indonesia having a US 1.1B net inflow of investors in the last 5 months compared to the other markets around Southeast Asia, I think having that, particularly in the technology space, is very interesting. Even AirTrunk, right? Essentially, I think it's a Macquarie investee company. And they're different from Amazon and NTT because they're hyperscalers serving serving hyperscalers as well as other customers. So, and you can see the kinds of discussion that you have in a melting pot of global players that provides the context and a deeper perspective into execution. So personally, I think it's a welcome move, and the government has been very supportive of investors into the country.
Thank you, Ishak. So let's now open up to the floor for questions. We have microphones. I'm not seeing anything on Slido now, but if there are questions from the floor for Ishak, I guess this is a great opportunity to ask him on the latest policy move that we're seeing. Let me check Slido again.
Sure.
Okay, looks like there is still no question that's come in. So let's now move on to cloud, or the digital part of the conversation earlier. So Malaysia is entering an early and multi-phase or multi-cycle secular investment cycle in hyperscale data centers. What are the advantages in your eyes? I know Mike has shared earlier the appeal to be in Malaysia, but in your eyes, what would be really the advantage of locating your data center in Malaysia, and how can we make that sustainable for investors?
It's huge. I think even the session earlier, they were merely scratching the surface, and now let me try to get deeper into this. So the obvious advantages of Malaysia data center, of course, number one, we benefited from the moratorium in Singapore from 2019 to mid-2022. That's a clear advantage. There was an overflow into Malaysia. So we have positive regulatory framework and a supportive government to facilitate those investments, number one. Number two, land. And of course, Johor has been touted as the biggest beneficiary for the data center. Number three, which is not seen, as I think Ben had intimated earlier, subsea cables. So all kinds of traffic, whether it's data center, 5G, etc., will require international connections. Now, Ministry of Transport under YB Anthony is re-looking back at the previously approved cabotage policy that will allow foreign flag ships to come into our waters and repair the subsea cables. This is extremely important because we had an outage of DMB 5G network 2 weeks ago, short outage. Once in a year, you'll have 1 or 2 outages from our players. And Telecom Malaysia, more, only because of the subsea cable connectivity, and they are the most exposed in terms of multiple subsea cable partners, as well as their unified network, etc. So having a cabotage policy that is supportive of quick recovery from repairs is extremely important. But the third one, we can end up talking for the next 2 hours, which is energy. So YB Rafizi had announced, along with YB Nick Nazmi, the policy to lift the energy exports, renewable energy exports from Malaysia in the next couple of months. So they've announced we will lift as a country the energy exports. And then the new Energy Commission Chairman, Muhammad Rashidan Muhammad Yusof, has also announced 1 week after that our new energy transition roadmap is coming out by the end of June. What it means is Malaysia, with our net zero goal of 2050, is now, the critics will say that it's late, but let me work out, share with you the details in this roadmap. Not the roadmap by EC, but the roadmap of where we are at. So Malaysia, we have announced that we will decommission coal plants by 2040. Tanjung Bin, I think, is about 1.4 gigawatts. Jima has about 1.5, 1.7 gigawatts. Kapar, 2.5 gigawatts. All these coal plants will be decommissioned by 2039, before our target of 2040. Right? So it's an aggressive roadmap. I do not know many other countries that is looking at subsea cable, fiber connectivity, 5G spectrum, MNOs, etc., and renewable energy as a major transition, aggressive transition, which will also allow new players to come in and the current players to evolve. So for example, YTL, they have announced a data center in Johor, and I think they are claiming, they have announced that 500 megawatt will be renewable energy funded. Actually, all this I picked up from Izzati's paper on the data center by Macquarie. So it's not me that being smart. I just memorized some numbers. But the point is, we have a relatively early and clear energy transition roadmap. And this brings clarity for data center investors into the country. I think Mike earlier alluded to where AirTrunk will be getting supply via the PPA from an energy provider. So again, on May 9th, actually almost a month ago, the Energy Commission opened up our CGPP, right? Corporate Green Power Purchase or something, CGPP, and that provides a roadmap for energy providers and suppliers to partner with companies like AirTrunk and all the other data centers to supply that. But saving the best for last, we must not forget Bursa's carbon exchange. So Bursa's carbon exchange announced in December, and I think the CGIP, that was partnership with Petronas last month, all these are key building blocks to provide an ecosystem for these cloud providers to come and say, hey, government supportive, land available, power green, I can offset my carbon exchange on BCX. Companies like Petronas are adopting it aggressively. What else do you need? Skilled workforce and labor. Well, we just heard NTT saying that 500 of their employees that serves non-Malaysian businesses, customers overseas. So to me, it does appear that we do have a very positive, vibrant building blocks for the cloud industry. But I think what it means is also it will facilitate the transition of Malaysian corporates and multinationals in Malaysia to begin that cloud transition, because some of that cloud are here. Of course, for disaster recovery, you will need to put clouds elsewhere around the region. As Amazon says, there are AZs and all that. But I am very excited about this space in the transition going forward. Irrespective of what we've gone through the last 2 years, I think, as some people say, it's always darkest before dawn. And I think that we are here at a stage and a point that we'll be able to pivot aggressively towards having the baseline infrastructure, the cloud service providers, and the use cases, etc., which is another huge topic.
Yeah, thank you for that great answer. And just staying with data centers, we've seen an influx of new supply coming in, about 700 megawatts in Johor, another 200 megawatts in the Klang Valley, and we are hearing more, including air trunks, prospecting for new sites and then potentially new deals. How is this going to affect, I guess, the returns for data center players, going forward with the sudden influx of new supply? And as you said, policy is very conducive for more players to come to the market.
It's a multi-dimensional question. I think first and foremost, in Macora's report, saying that, quoting Knight Frank, of 920 megawatts of data center coming on stream in the next 10 years, I think they'll be busted in 5 years. Because if you look at all the BUSTED, busted in 5 years, because if you look at all the announcements and all the developments and all the applications via MDEC, license, MCMC, and state government, Invest Johor, etc., what we see is more than 920 megawatts will be built and filled within the next 5 years. As a background, data centers of this hyperscale level, investments are required are between 500 million ringgit to 2-3 billion ringgit. The time to plan is about 6 to 12 months. Time to build is about 1 to 2 years, 18 to 24 months, right? So going to your question, data center players first speak to global hyperscalers, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Facebook, TikTok, ByteDance, etc. They are the anchor customers. These anchor customers plan 5 years ahead. That's the cycle. So we heard Palo Alto Networks saying that they produce 55 terabytes of data per day. Do not ask me how much TikTok produces per day. It's insane, unthinkable, right? So when these players plan their data center requirements, and as they talk to hyperscalers, because not all of them build their own data centers, by the way, right? So it's a 5-year ahead plan, and they work backwards. So the contract with the hyperscaler, it's literally 5 years ahead, etc., etc., etc. Now, coming to revenue, most of these hyperscalers work for the Google, Amazon, Facebook, TikTok, etc., at a global level. So those are their anchor customers. They may be in Johor, they may be in Penang, they may be in Sabah and Sarawak, which are building massive facilities, by the way, because of the Nusantara, Balikpapan potential transition from Indonesian capital. Most of the hyperscalers leverage on the global investors, global companies as their anchor. And then they have what I call fillers. So as in the context of Malaysia, as we scale into the cloud, corporates scale into the cloud very aggressively, we'll have enough capacity to handle that. My gut feeling is capacity will never be enough. I know it sounds like a lot. I mean, 900, 1,000 megawatt of data center space, but it's just intense. That's the demand for data, which then opens up cybersecurity. That's another area as well. It's just tremendous.
That's really good to know. I'm looking at a few questions now in Slido, so I'll pick a few direct questions on DNB, which I think you would like. I think first, in your opinion, how would the second network be rolled out differently than DNB?
Simple, actually. Businesses are run with a profit motive. Governments don't dictate that. And very happy to note, this morning, YB Fahmi in his speech, or rather on the panel, mentioned that, yes, the first network will hit 80%. The second network, like the first network after that, will be free to do and target and plan their own investments because these are private companies, these are public listed companies, right? And businesses, infrastructure companies, build infrastructure to cater for demand. The telcos know where the demand are. Izzati said earlier about Maxis knowing her social network, etc., etc. You can use a VPN, Izzati, don't worry, so the telcos won't see how long you're on Facebook, how long you're on, etc. But coming back to the point, the telcos, Network 1, Network 2, will be allowed to deploy the network where the demand cycle are, etc. I have no doubts about that. I know that today in the media, sometimes we read unclear messages. But I'm very happy to note that today it was very, very clear from Wabi Fahmi, Dr. Johan, as well as the MNOs, that the sunrise has come, and I think we'll be moving forward with that. Two networks being able to provide redundancy, competition, and most importantly, meet market demand, which would then lead to profitability. I think the telco space has been relatively flat, as we had opined earlier. That's because the transition from 4G to 5G is just about to happen. And 5G is all about enterprise. And that brings about new margins, new revenues, new adoption, which clearly, bottom line, one network cannot fulfill. How can a single network of 5G meet the needs of how many ports do we have in Malaysia? How many plantations? MIDA has 27 main industrial parks, but there are hundreds of industrial parks because of those different states, etc. A single network cannot meet those needs. And if you think about it, a dual network will be very busy to meet those needs, right? And there are very specific needs: the infrastructure layer, the security layer, and the various stacks of applications within manufacturing, etc. you spoke about.
Thank you. So there's still quite a fair bit of interest on why the pushback by MNOs against DNB, especially on the equity stake acquisition or purchase. Can you share, what were the deficiencies or reasons for the pushback, really? Yeah.
Tough one. Okay. So I think first and foremost, as you had alluded to earlier as well, the valuations, etc., had been suppressed due to transparency. So I think that as a 100% government-owned company, rolling out a fresh network, DNB had their own path, and they were busy rolling out. Somewhat, the MNOs then, we're talking about 2 years ago. Now, DNB was announced as the 5G SPV, just for context, on February 19th, 2021, in the then Prime Minister's speech launching My Digital. So DNB was a subset. It was called a 5G SPV. DNB was incorporated in March 2021, 2 years ago. And from March to April, the board members, management came in, which they had expired. The contract is 2 years, this year, March and April, and they've since transitioned. So when you talk about the pushbacks from the telcos, life is mixed, right? You are the incumbent. You have run a business with your EBITDA margins and your dividends and your customers, as Alban alluded to earlier, 34 million customers between them. When there's a new player, like we saw with YTL, when they first came on board, yes, the Yes Communication Network, remember? Until today, if you put Wing on the stage with the MNOs, there'll be very interesting dynamics because it's a new player, it's a small player, etc. So I think there's a fair bit of competitiveness between MNOs and DNB. Underlying that is, Malaysia has not been used to have a monopoly. So this is not only a monopoly, but a monopoly of the fresh rainbow horizon of which telcos are dependent for new revenue, new income, new customers, and their own evolution to transition to enterprise customers and all that. So clearly then the dynamics was a bit negative, right? It didn't help that the transparency issue wasn't there, but welcome November 19, and I think that this government from the start has been very clear on its position with regards to investments, with regards to the government's focus, with regards to being business-friendly and industry-friendly. And I think, yes, it has been almost 7 months, but as opposed to the last 2 years of, dark clouds, 7 months of this, I would call rapid progress, is fantastic. Can we do better? Of course. Can we move faster to this transition? Yes. Why does the second network need to wait till next year before? Why can't they do it now? Well, as YB Minister has stated, there are legal agreements bounding DNB to some of their contracts and supplies, and the government has to respect that because we are run by the rule of law. That is fine. So we transition. And as long as we're clear in terms of what the end game is. I think working backwards and making sure that there's transparency, there's efficiency, and the continuity in the growth of the economy via the telcos, which are, as Tan Sri said earlier, 234 billion market cap TMT actually in the KLSE. I think it's a positive.
Thank you for that answer. Now I'll pick one more question from Slido. With limited or no monetization for consumer, will B2B use cases be enough to yield positive ROI for 5G network, more so for a dual 5G network?
Totally, totally. So manufacturing, repeating, 22% of GDP, agriculture, 7%, I think, tourism, 7%. What was the other one? There was one, 14.5%, I can't remember. When you look at all the sectors, 1,000 odd companies on Bursa, 1.2 million SMEs, all kinds of demands. Yeah, just taking simple, I think Eng used the example of the port earlier. Security camera, clearly processed in the cloud in order to detect security breaches, in order to do heat detection. There was one use case we did in Langkawi in 2019. You're going to laugh. It's so simple. The port obviously has a petrol diesel tank. Next to it, staff would park their motorcycles. During lunch, they smoke next to the tank and they throw the cigarette butt there. That's a safety risk, right? So having high definition cameras processing in the cloud about recognizing the danger of a human being there, smoking, triggers the security guard to go and ask them to move away. It's a simple use case. And I'm not even going to autonomous vehicles and robotics, etc. Simple use cases on that clearly shows you that within the various verticals, it is required. Take a step back. From a government perspective, yes, education is massive. Yes, entertainment is massive. But one more thing that's important, safety, smart cities. We have approximately 150 pihak berkuasa tempatan or local councils. Each local council is responsible for the traffic lights, for the lampposts, etc., right? In order to maintain the safety of the city, they do need to do monitoring, etc. So again, a whole bunch of use cases in smart cities and all that, traffic flow, etc., water, IoT, movement, law enforcement. We can be here until tomorrow, from PDRM, from immigration, from Ministry of Defense, right? Tremendous amount of applications, UAVs, etc. So the short answer is yes. 2, or as Minister even intimated, 3 networks, whatever the number of networks, there are enough use cases, business, revenue that can be made because society is transitioning from our previous era into this 5G era, connected world, cloud, etc. And 5G, as a recap, brings about 3 benefits. Ultra high speed, right, gigabit speed. 1 million IoT devices per square kilometer. 4G is only 100,000. And latency, where they talk about remote surgery, autonomous vehicles, robots, and all that. Very fast, zero latency networks. So just based on these 3 attributes of 5G, one can just imagine the kind of applications that we can have in all our various industry sectors across the country.
So I recall you experimented on 9 sector verticals during your time.
Yeah.
Again, you may have shared this with us, but just to really emphasize and highlight the point, if you can pinpoint 2 or 3 sector verticals that really are set apart from the rest in terms of the value created, commercialization and all that, what are they? If you recall.
I won't do a stock pick. I'll leave that to Ben and Izzati, and Max and Daniel, your team.
You know what
you don't want to hear my stock pick. I haven't opened my Bursa anywhere in a long time, which maybe it's time after today. I've got some clarity. Just kidding. So yeah, I think when we looked at it then, from our lens, and the lens today could be different. Again, I'm not in office, I'm not in service. So the lens then, we looked at the industry sectors and GDP contribution in the country, and we picked manufacturing, etc., etc. But within those things are also the potential for early adopters. So within manufacturing, which are the companies that was keen to adopt? And guess what? Proton and Prodor came because they were also transitioning. They knew. So Proton and Prodor, just like Google, Amazon, Facebook, we're planning their production 5 years down the road. EVs coming. Remember how Proton has pivoted? I think last year they said, oh, we're getting to EVs in 2027. And then be all ready and go, oh man, I can't afford an EV right now. I got to wait that long. But then when this government started expediting objectives and targets and all that, Proton has come out and said, okay, bringing the smart model this year, Q4. So I think everyone's looking forward to that. In fact, 2 models of smart coming in here. Prodor with its cars, which has autonomous emergency braking, etc., is really at that 40,000 ringgit price point, having the sensors and the cameras already built into these cars. So within manufacturing, the automotive guys came out. Within government, education. So I was called a couple of times then to the Ministry of Education to see how the Bestarinet then can transition or pivot or get enhanced to provide those things. And I think Maxis also mentioned earlier about, May mentioned about E-Class, which is a program that they have on that, etc. Now, agriculture, it was fascinating. And 2,000, I can't remember the numbers now, 2,000 or 3,000 vegetables in one 40-foot container, right? 42-day harvest for your first round, 30-day harvest for your second round. So imagine, today you are planting paddy in Kedah or Kelantan or Terengganu with urban farming, land by the state government, containers. Well, there used to be many, but the pandemic caused containers to have a shortage. But planting and becoming a farmer, agriculture person with the income that YB mentioned earlier, 5x for the paddy staff, is a real possibility. And we saw that. So we had an event on January 19th where Tun, YP Gobin, etc. were the guests. We planted the vegetables to be used for the dinner 42 days prior to that in Langkawi itself, in a container. And it was harvested on January 19 morning and served on the table on night of the dinner. And it was all on 5G because IoT. The guys were in KL. They didn't have to be there. The chemicals, the water, the light, the air conditioning temperature were all controlled remotely from Kuala Lumpur by Boomgrow, a local company, local IP. So it's amazing. Sorry, I get very excited about these things.
That sounds really great. I have one more question here, and this goes back to cloud and adoption of, or digitalization rather. Should the government lead the way by upskilling the civil servants and in-housing e-government services, for example, to start with?
Yes, and the government has a plan in place. So 19 February 2021, My Digital had 6 thrusts. The first thrust is, guess what? Civil service improvisation. So the training of civil service, the adoption of technology, etc., etc. I can't remember the strategies now. It was 6 trusts, and each trust had multiple strategies. So My Digital was a comprehensive set of a national digital roadmap that encompassed civil service to the various sectors, infrastructure, as well as the cloud, as well as the submarine cables and all those things. Now, I think it's interesting. Now, AI comes into the picture. Certain things will be done via the use of AI, and it will reduce the need for manpower, etc. But this is where the reskilling, retraining of the government employees under Intan or some new enhanced institution will continue to be important, and that's exactly what the government is planning to do. Unfortunately, I have no view on the progress of My Digital. It was launched in 2021, whether they are tracking well or whether they're behind time. But in government and in business, the timeframes we are talking about is 5 to 10 years. I'm sure the respective ministries, in this particular case, would be YB Rafizi's, EPU, would be tracking it well to ensure that the various objectives are achieved. And not all the time it can be achieved, not all the time everything's on track. We'll just have to play catch up.
Thank you. I still have a few questions coming in. I think we still have a good 20 minutes to go before we conclude. And sorry for jumping around on the topic. And now moving back to 5G. The question here is, on the second 5G company, will there be any compatibility issue using Huawei infrastructure? And can it be seamless or complementary with Ericsson?
Yeah. Easy answer. Technology, telcos, IT, etc., are based on standards, ITU standards. So spectrum, frequency, chips, etc., etc. So whether it's Huawei, Nokia, Ericsson, ZTE, compatibility is there. Our phones today, whether it's a 500 ringgit phone or a 5,000 ringgit phone, which exists, has multiple spectrum layers with chipsets from Exynos, which is Samsung, MediaTek, Qualcomm, of course Huawei have their own Kirin chipsets. So they've all been produced and manufactured based on standards. So no issue of compatibility. However, yes, if the supplier of the network is Huawei and your handset is Huawei, naturally there'll be some slight performance improvement tweaked, done, which will give the Huawei ecosystem. But it's very minimal and it's really negligible. So there is no issue in terms of compatibility. Of course, Ericsson no longer makes phones, right? They sold it to Microsoft, I think, Sony Ericsson, 15 years ago or something, right? Yeah, so no issue, because they're all following international standards. Justification for that, with our phone, you land in Thailand, you land in Singapore, you land in the US, you can use the phone on some networks, so no-brainer, which is good for everyone, yeah.
The other question I have here on 5G is, so 5G is supposed to have much lower latency than 4G, but current available 5G seems to have similar latency as 4G. So would a second network change or improve that?
Yeah, so this is when it gets technical. Okay. Yes, 5G has lower latency than 4G. However, 5G with the lowest latency is on the spectrum that is higher up in the band. So that's one. So 5G can be done today on our 900 megahertz, which is used for 4G, 1800, 2300, 2600, and 3.5. So DMB today is using on 3.5. We have 200 megahertz on 3.5, so it'll be 100 each for the two MNOs or two 5G companies. And then fiber. The latency is also dependent on the infrastructure, the backhaul from the tower to the various gateways and all that. So essentially, there is a lot of technical layer which Mei Ching and their colleagues in Ella, I'm clearly not qualified to speak technically, but there are many things that need to be optimized across the network in order for us to achieve the latency, which leads to the enterprise application, which is why private networks, as Alban had alluded to earlier, and all the MNOs are looking at, private networks specific to manufacturing, oil and gas, etc., will be very exclusive network tweaked and tuned to deliver the latency required. Over and above that, you have the network slicing ability. So the same spectrum or the same, I can't remember the technical term, you can slice, let's take an example, in China, for example, law enforcement is using a slice of the spectrum from the public band, for example, right? So network slicing and the three attributes of 5G will require a lot of optimization, which the telcos will be getting into at the right time when we have the various use cases, our demand is coming up, so no issue.
So there's a question on spectrum here. How much is the 700 megahertz and 3.5 gigahertz spectrums worth, in your view?
Again, this is not my time. Back then, as is publicly noted as well, I think some of your I read RHB research report on May 5th, 2 days after the announcement. RHB wrote there, IB, Jeffrey probably, wrote there about 6 billion ringgit. That's not far off. So if we take the spectrum rates of 2017 to 2018, my time was 2018, 2020, then 703.5 is about 5 to 6 billion ringgit on a beauty contest approach. So there's income to the government, MCMC, right? Now, if you take 2023 onwards, etc., who's to say? It's YB Fahmi, Tan Sri Salim as the current chairman of MCMC, and the regulator and the government can decide whether it is a 7, 8, 9 billion ringgit cost to that. But on the flip side, so I sometimes get a bit concerned. There's a lot of discussion about costs, but cost is a function of revenue. What the telcos do, the MNOs do with the spectrum that they have in hand, and how they monetize it across the various applications and use cases, there is no greener field than 5G. Because the applications that we spoke about the whole day today, half day today, can't be done on 4G. So even if, I think, RHB also said that, they'll reduce the target price because of the margins. There'll be some margin compression due to the cost of the spectrum, etc. But I think because there's not been enough analysis and discussion and exploration and research into how the MNOs are going to use the cost of a couple of billion ringgit for network, a couple of billion ringgit for spectrum, over the next 15, 20 years. Spectrum regulation in Malaysia, the regulator can release a spectrum between 5 to 20 years. Historically, we have always released 15 years. So that's the lifespan when you look at amortization, etc.
Thank you. And I think one last question, and this is really directed to you as technopreneur in the past. What's your view on the role of startup will be in terms of stirring investment interests?
I think I know where this question is coming from. I think what's a fair question and what's missing in today's discussion is that really. I started as an entrepreneur in 1994, 25 years old. I had hair, right? And that was June 1994, Netscape produced the first browser, right? We all remember because all the guys here, we are old guys, right? Not the young ones. So I started in August 1994. And at that point, there was no Series A, there was no Series B, there was no MDAC, there was no Futurize, there was no Magic, there was no government incentive, there was no Axiata getting tax breaks for their 200 million investments in ADA, etc., etc. It was the wild, wild west. We had to survive. I had 6 startups, 4 died. Luckily, the 2 that survived, I managed to sell to foreign partners, by the way, one French and one American, put me above water and kept me alive from all those credit card debts as a young startup guy, etc., because there was no funding, right? So, likewise in this phase, we will see, I'm projecting, a lot of interesting M&As happening. Now, there's a lot of capital out there looking for solutions. We've seen how Google, Facebook, Amazon, etc., has made very strategic acquisitions, and for example, in the autonomous vehicle project, and it rolls out to be a product, right? I think Apple, 2 nights ago, launched Vision Pro, right? Augmented reality, etc. But Vision Pro is made available only because they had some acquisitions of startups, 100, 200 million US dollars, many years down the road before they could create a product. So startups with their agility, with their nimbleness, with the audacity of the founder's vision, and the availability of capital, of course, primarily in Silicon Valley, Singapore, Hong Kong, etc. But I think this is Bursa's role here to stimulate that. In fact, my first foreign investor in the year 2000 on June 8th, actually, tomorrow is a year. Tomorrow is an anniversary, is in the room next door. My startup had investments from PCCW, Hong Kong, and SoftBank in the year 2000. And we did the launching there with the chairman of Masdaq then, Dato' Khairil Abdullah. So startups will play a very significant role in Maxis to roll out their enterprise solutions beyond the cloud services providers, etc., Celcom, Digi, etc., but also people like Axiata who had adopted the startup mentality to kickstart some things, some areas here and there. And then I think from the various other industry sectors, beyond the TMT, startups will always be the gem or the spark that triggers and facilitates industry growth and development. I am 24 years a startup guy from my 31-year career, so.
Thank you, Ishak. That's
Thanks.
really inspiring. So before we end, maybe one last concluding remark or key takeaway from today, from your perspective.
Sure. So I think from the context of Bursa and Macquarie and investors in the market, the 5G discussions have been clearly overloaded. I think we're at the end of the grey skies. We're at the end of the opacity. I think clarity has arrived, and I think that will bring us into the real adoption phase. Yes, it was announced last week. It's only 3 million because that's only consumer. We haven't looked at enterprise and all that, right? 3.1%, sorry, 1.2 million consumers, etc. But with that comes the next phase of deployment, adoption, investments, and all that. Data centers. The stock picks on Bursa would be construction companies beyond telcos. Of course, telcos are there, right? If the data center is going to be built over 18 months, etc., 24 months, and the value of data center, of course, a lot of it is in the IT equipment and all that, but construction companies, subsea cables, telcos, and the other parts of the ecosystem would be the biggest beneficiary. Technology, the technology space continues to evolve. I must say, I have lost touch from the 1984 till 2023 in terms of what are the details of AI, etc. Of course, I'm aware. Cybersecurity. In all of this, getting online, getting connected, cybersecurity, cyber resilience, as our Palo Alto colleague mentioned, cyber hygiene to begin with, these will spin up a lot of companies, a lot of services that will be required. So as the economy pivots into this whole new area, lots of companies will be coming up. And I really believe, of course, we have the Ukraine situation still there. We have the China-US concerns or friction still there. But life goes on. And I think that we'll be seeing a lot of money flow coming back in. In fact, I read somewhere that our real negative foreign money flow for the last 12 months up to May is just 0.4 billion US dollars or something. It is not that much. Yes, if you look at a certain period, it'll be a lot. We are number 2 to Thailand. Indonesia is positive inflow. But when you look at a 12-month horizon, and in finance, you look at longer-term horizon, I think we've seen the worst, barring caveat those 2 black swan events that we don't know will happen. But all that aside, when we look at the industry, the growth, the investments being done, the government policy being put forward, I think there's a lot to look forward to, definitely, inshallah.
Thank you, Ishak. So that concludes our session this afternoon. Thank you.